I sat perfectly still. 300 Marines stood at rigid attention. The auditorium was dead silent. Then my own sister leaned across the aisle. She looked at the purple heart pinned to my chest. She sneered. She called it a fake. She called me a fraud, right to my face. She thought I would just sit there and take it. She thought I was still her silent bank account. But she forgot one critical detail. You do not survive a burning armored vehicle in the desert just to let a parasite drain your blood at home. I did not scream. I just pulled the bank records. This is a story about the brutal cost of toxic loyalty and the absolute power of walking away. If you have ever had to protect your peace from the people who share your blood, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and share your own survival story. The air in the auditorium was dead. It was heavy. It pressed down on my shoulders like wet wool. I sat perfectly still. My spine was a rigid line of steel against the wooden chair. I wore my dress blues. The fabric was crisp. The brass buttons caught the harsh fluorescent light of the ceiling. A purple heart was pinned to my chest. The metal was cold. The ribbon was a deep, bruised shade of violet. It felt heavier than it looked. It felt like an anchor. To my left sat my family. They took up space like an occupying army. My father, Richard, shifted in his seat. He checked his heavy gold watch. He cleared his throat. He wanted to be anywhere else. To him, this room held no value. There were no stock options here. There were no real estate deals. There was only me. And I was the daughter who never made sense to him. I was the daughter who chose a uniform over a corner office. My mother, Margaret, sat next to him. She clutched a designer handbag in her lap. Her knuckles were white. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty stage. She played the part of the proud mother, but her smile was brittle. It was a thin layer of frost over a deep, freezing lake. And then there was Evelyn, my older sister, the golden child. Evelyn wore a silk dress that cost more than my monthly hazard pay. She crossed her legs. She sighed loudly. She made sure the entire row heard her boredom. She hated sharing the spotlight. She hated that, for 1 hour. The world was not revolving around her latest country club drama. General Harrison walked onto the stage. The room fell utterly silent. 300 men and women in uniform snapped to attention. The sound of their boots hitting the floor was a thunderclap. It was a single, unified strike of absolute respect. I stood with them. My family remained seated. They looked around, confused by the sudden shift in gravity. I took my seat. The general approached the wooden podium. He adjusted the microphone. The speakers let out a low hum. Right at that exact second, Evelyn leaned across the aisle. She invaded my space. I could smell her expensive perfume. It smelled like crushed orchids and entitlement. She stared at the metal on my chest. Her lips curled into a vicious, ugly sneer. She did not whisper. She threw her voice. She wanted her friends in the row behind us to hear. She wanted the young Marines to my right to hear. A purple heart. Evelyn scoffed. Her voice cut through the silent room like a razor blade. Please. You probably bought that prop online. Glorified secretaries do not bleed. What a desperate cry for attention. The silence in the auditorium shattered. It did not break into noise. It broke into a suffocating, lethal vacuum. The young Marine sitting to my right turned his head. His eyes went completely dark. 2 rows back, a gunnery sergeant shifted his weight. The fabric of his uniform creaked. The tension was massive. It was a physical force. General Harrison stopped. He did not look at his notes. He looked up. His eyes locked directly onto Evelyn. He possessed the kind of authority that could freeze a river. He gripped the edges of the podium. His knuckles turned stark white. He leaned into the microphone. "Ma'am," General Harrison said. His voice was a low rumble. It shook the floorboards. "You are sitting in a room full of ghosts. You are sitting among men and women who have written blank checks to this country with their own blood." Evelyn froze. Her arrogant smirk faltered. She looked around. The eyes of 300 combat veterans were locked onto her. There was no pity in their faces. There was only absolute, unadulterated disgust. General Harrison picked up a heavy manila folder from the podium. It was marked with thick red tape. Declassified. He opened it. Captain Claire Olson did not buy that ribbon, the general stated. His words were slow. They were deliberate. October 14th, forward operating base. An improvised explosive device struck her convoy. The vehicle was compromised. The heat was catastrophic. My father stopped looking at his watch. His head snapped up. Captain Olson sustained a massive arterial injury to her left arm. Harrison continued. The words fell like heavy stones. She was bleeding out. Visibility was zero. A dust storm grounded all medical evacuations. She was given a direct order to shelter in place. My mother put her hand over her mouth. She knew none of this. I had never told them. They had never asked. Captain Olson disobeyed that order. The general said. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. She refused to leave her team in a burning chassis. Using one good arm, she mapped a blind tactical retreat. She physically dragged Staff Sergeant Miller and Private Davis out of the kill zone. She navigated them through a blinding storm for 2 miles. She held her own severed artery shut with her bare hand. She saved 2 lives. She bought their futures with her own flesh. General Harrison closed the folder. The sound was a sharp crack. True power is not loud, the general said, staring dead into Evelyn's pale face. It does not belittle. True power is standing in the fire so others can walk out alive. A society that disrespects its protectors is a society destined to fail. That medal is a permanent record of a debt you will never be able to repay. I sat in my chair. I did not look at Evelyn. I did not look at my father. I looked straight ahead. For years, I had craved their validation. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn their respect. But in that moment, a massive, profound clarity washed over my brain. True respect is given freely. It is not purchased. It is not begged for. You cannot buy a person's dignity. You cannot force them to see your worth. I realized the brutal truth. They were not blind to my value. They simply chose to ignore it. They ignored it because my strength highlighted their weakness. I took a slow, deep breath. The air no longer felt heavy. It felt like oxygen. I did not stay for the reception. I did not wait for the forced handshakes or the awkward family photos. When the ceremony broke, I stood up. I walked down the center aisle. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy glass doors at the back of the hall. I pushed through them and stepped out into the biting evening air. The silence of the parking lot was a massive relief. I unlocked my car. I slid into the driver's seat. I gripped the leather steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. I was a trained intelligence officer. I was trained to analyze threats. I was trained to dismantle enemy networks. For 35 years, I had treated my family like a safe harbor. I was wrong. They were a hostile theater of operations. I drove home in total silence. I did not turn on the radio. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound. My mind was moving fast. It was sorting data. It was connecting dots I had deliberately ignored for a decade. I thought about the money. For 10 years, I had subsidized my family as perfect suburban illusion. I sent money home every month. It was my combat pay. It was my hazard bonuses. My mother, Margaret, would call me on a secure line. She would cry softly into the receiver. She told me my father's investments were failing. She told me she had massive medical bills. She told me Richard would leave her if he found out they were broke. I paid to buy her peace. I paid to keep her safe. I sacrificed my own comfort. I lived in a barren apartment. I drove a 10-year-old car. I funded their survival because I believed family protected family. I pulled into my driveway. I walked inside. The apartment was dark. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I walked straight to my small wooden desk. I opened my rugged military laptop. The screen glowed a pale, cold blue in the dark room. It was time to do the math. I logged into my secure banking portal. I bypassed the standard statements. I pulled the master ledger. I set the filter parameters. I dragged the transaction history back exactly 10 years. I hit execute. The screen populated with hundreds of rows of black text. It was a digital graveyard of my own sacrifice. I started tracking the routing numbers. I traced the wire transfers I had sent to my mother's private emergency account. I cross-referenced the destination banks. My fingers moved over the keyboard with lethal precision. Clack, clack, clack. The sound echoed in the empty room. The first anomaly appeared in a file from 2021. I had wired $15,000. Margaret told me she needed a critical surgery. She told me insurance refused to cover it. I traced the routing number. The money did not go to a hospital network. It did not go to a medical billing entity. The routing number belonged to a commercial real estate holding company. I ran the company name through a public records database. The screen blinked. The registration document loaded. The primary shareholder was Evelyn, my sister. The same sister who called me a glorified secretary. My mother did not have surgery. She took my hazard pay. She funneled it directly into Evelyn's failing luxury boutique business. She took the money I earned sleeping in dirt and dodging shrapnel, and she used it to buy Evelyn imported silk curtains and Italian tile. My chest went completely hollow. The betrayal was not a sharp stab. It was a slow, suffocating poison. I kept digging. I was ruthless now. I pulled the records from 2023. This was the year my vehicle was hit. This was the year my arm was torn apart. I had spent 4 months in a military rehabilitation center. I was heavily medicated. I was learning how to hold a fork again. During that time, the military issued a massive back pay disability compensation check. It was meant to cover my catastrophic injuries. I never saw the check. My mother told me it was delayed in the bureaucracy. She told me not to worry. I hacked into my own archived mail logs. I pulled the scanned images of cashed checks from that quarter. The image of the disability check loaded on the screen. It was made out to me. $32,000. I zoomed in on the back of the check. The endorsement signature was there. It read Claire Olson. It was not my handwriting. The loops were wrong. The slant was wrong. It was my mother's handwriting. She had forged my signature while I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked to a morphine drip. She had stolen the money given to me for my permanent physical pain. I traced that deposit. It went into a joint account. 2 days later, a cashier's check was cut from that exact account. The payee was a luxury car dealership. Evelyn had purchased a brand new SUV that same week. I sat back in my chair. The blue light washed over my face. I did not cry. Crying was for the confused. I was no longer confused. I saw the architecture of their abuse perfectly clearly. Financial abuse wrapped in familial love is still abuse. They had turned my empathy into a weapon. They had used my loyalty to fund their vanity. They believed I was too weak to check. They believed I was too desperate for their love to ever demand accountability. I highlighted the entire 10-year spreadsheet. I hit the calculate button. The total sum appeared at the bottom of the screen. $214,000. I reached out and gently closed the laptop. The room plunged into total darkness. I was done being the victim. I was done being the silent vault holding their dirty secrets. Equality sentence means we are all held to the same standard of the law and morality. You do not get a free pass to steal my life just because we share DNA. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a fresh ream of printer paper. I pulled out my legal folders. The operation was no longer about survival. It was about dismantling the enemy supply line. I was going to cut the financial cord, and then I was going to burn the bridge completely to the ground. The morning sun breached the horizon. It bled through the blinds of my apartment. It cast long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. I had not slept. I did not need sleep. I was operating on a different kind of fuel. It was the cold, clean energy of absolute clarity. I sat at my wooden desk. The military laptop was closed. The evidence was printed. The manila folder sat perfectly squared on the edge of the table. It contained $214,000 worth of betrayal. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I brewed black coffee. The bitter scent filled the small space. I drank it standing up. I stared out the window at the empty street. Today was not a day for anger. Anger is sloppy. Anger makes mistakes. Today was a day for surgical precision. I was an intelligence officer. I was about to execute a strategic financial strike on my own bloodline. At exactly 8 in the morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of my bank. The lobby was quiet. The marble floors gleamed. I sat down across from a senior branch manager. His name was Thomas. He wore a crisp blue suit. He smiled a practiced, customer service smile. He asked how he could help me. I placed my military identification on his desk. I placed my account numbers next to it. I did not smile back. I spoke in a flat, dead-level tone. I instructed him to freeze every joint account associated with my name. I ordered a complete stop on all recurring wire transfers. I demanded that my hazard pay pipeline be instantly severed. Thomas typed on his keyboard. His smile vanished. He looked at the screen. He saw the volume of capital moving through those accounts. He hesitated. He asked if I was absolutely certain. He warned me that severing these links without notice would cause immediate bounce checks for the secondary account holders. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that was exactly the objective. I told him to authorize the freeze. The printer hummed. The freeze confirmations slid into the tray. I signed them. The financial cord was officially cut. Evelyn's luxury boutique was now out of oxygen. My mother's secret slush fund was completely drained. The fake empire they had built on my broken back was standing on a trapdoor. I had just pulled the lever. But cutting the money was only the first phase. I needed to establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter. I left the bank and drove straight to the base legal office. The judge advocate general was a stern woman named Major Hayes. She had seen every type of human failing. She had prosecuted theft, fraud, and desertion. I walked into her office. I set the manila folder on her metal desk. I opened it. I slid the scanned image of the $32,000 disability check across the table. I pointed to the forged signature. I handed her the wire transfer receipts proving the stolen funds went directly to Evelyn's luxury vehicle purchase. Major Hayes analyzed the documents. The silence in the room stretched. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hard. She recognized a felony when she saw one. She asked me if I wanted to press federal charges against my mother. I shook my head. I told her I did not want them in a courtroom. A courtroom gives narcissists a stage. I wanted something far more permanent. I wanted total, absolute exile. I instructed Major Hayes to draft a formal cease and desist order. I wanted a legally binding document detailing the exact nature of their theft. I wanted a permanent ban on all contact, if they ever approached me, if they ever called my command. The federal fraud charges would be filed that exact same day. It was mutually assured destruction. It was the only language a predator understands. By noon, the documents were notarized. They were placed in a heavy, rigid envelope. I did not use the postal service. I hired a private process server. I gave him a specific address. I gave him a specific time window. At 1 o'clock, Evelyn was hosting a lavish champagne luncheon at her boutique. She was surrounded by wealthy investors and local socialites. She was standing in the center of her expensive showroom, sipping imported wine, entirely funded by my stolen blood money. The process server walked right through the front doors. He did not care about the crystal glasses or the designer clothes. He walked straight up to Evelyn in front of her entire audience. He asked for her by name. She smiled, assuming it was a delivery of exotic fabrics. He handed her the thick envelope. He announced, loudly and clearly, that she had been legally served. He turned on his heel and walked out. I was not there to see her open it. I did not need to be. I knew exactly what would happen. She would tear the envelope open. She would see the bank freeze notices. She would see the forged check evidence. She would read the legal threat of federal prison. Her lungs would suddenly realize they had no air. The siege had begun. I drove back to my apartment. I took off my uniform boots. I sat on my couch. For the first time in 10 years, my paycheck belonged entirely to me. My future belonged entirely to me. The silence in my apartment was no longer lonely. It was the sound of absolute freedom. The shockwave hit the very next morning. A parasite does not go quietly when you detach it from the host. It thrashes. It desperately tries to reattach. Evelyn was thrashing. Her boutique S operating account had bounced 3 vendor payments by dawn. Her credit lines were maxed. The illusion was collapsing in real time. Evelyn panicked. She fell back on her only survival tactic. She went to the country club. She needed to control the narrative before the truth leaked out. She needed to paint me as the villain. She sat at a corner table on the outdoor patio. She was surrounded by 3 affluent women. Evelyn dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin. She played the tragic victim. She spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. She claimed I had suffered a mental breakdown. She claimed the military had ruined my mind. She told me I was paranoid, unstable, and had vindictively frozen the family S estate out of sheer combat trauma. She expected sympathy. She expected them to validate her lies. She did not realize who was sitting 2 tables away. Staff Sergeant Miller was having lunch with her civilian contractor husband. Miller was the Marine I had dragged out of the burning chassis in the dust storm. She carried severe burn scars up her right arm. She heard every single poisonous word Evelyn spoke. Miller did not shout. She did not throw a drink. She was a disciplined United States Marine. She stood up. She walked calmly over to Evelyn's table. She carried a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was a copy of the declassified commendation from the ceremony. Miller stopped at the edge of the table. Evelyn looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "Excuse me," Miller said. Her voice was flat, commanding, and projected perfectly across the patio. The surrounding tables fell silent. "I believe you are speaking about Captain Claire Olson." Evelyn's fake smile faltered. "Who are you?" Miller placed the paper face up on the glass table. "I am the woman who is alive today because your sister ignored a direct order, crawled into a raging fire, and held my ruptured artery closed with her bare hands while taking enemy fire." The 3 affluent women stared at Miller. They stared at the burn scars on her arm. "Captain Olson does not have a broken mind," Miller stated, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the clubhouse. "She has a spine made of steel. She cut you off because you are a thief. You used her hazard pay to buy your shoes. You are a fraud." Miller did not wait for a response. She turned and walked away. Evelyn sat completely frozen. The women at her table slowly pushed their chairs back. They picked up their purses. They walked away, leaving Evelyn sitting entirely alone in the wreckage of her own reputation. 4 hours later, the final confrontation arrived. I was walking out of the base command center. The late afternoon sun was hot. I saw my father's heavy pickup truck idling in the parking lot. Richard stepped out. His face was purple with rage. The bank freeze had hit his accounts, too. The process server had delivered the legal threat regarding the forged check. He stormed across the asphalt toward me. He raised his hand, pointing a thick, calloused finger at my face. He opened his mouth to roar. He wanted to demand obedience. He wanted to force me back into my designated box. I did not flinch. I did not shrink. I stepped directly into his space. I closed the distance so fast he actually stumbled backward. "Do not speak," I commanded. My voice was a lethal weapon. It was the voice I used in a combat zone. It left absolutely no room for debate. Richard's mouth snapped shut. He looked at me, genuinely shocked. I pulled a single piece of paper from my uniform pocket. It was a copy of the forged disability check. I shoved it directly against his chest. He reflexively grabbed it. "You are holding federal fraud," I said, my eyes locked onto his. "Your wife stole money given to me for my permanent physical pain. She used it to buy Evelyn a car. And you stood by and let it happen. You are not a patriarch. You are an accomplice to a thief." He looked down at the paper. His broad shoulders suddenly caved in. The blustering rage evaporated. He looked exactly like what he was. An old, weak man. "True human rights begin at home, Richard," I said. I spoke the words clearly, deliberately, letting them hang in the heavy air. "Equality means we are all held to the exact same standard of the law and morality. You do not get a free pass to abuse me just because we share DNA. Financial abuse wrapped in familial duty is still abuse. I am breaking the cycle. You have absolutely no power here anymore. I turned my back on him. I walked to my car. I got in. I drove away, leaving him standing alone on the hot asphalt, holding the undeniable proof of his family's rot. Healing does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes, the most profound act of self-love is walking away from the people who demand you set yourself on fire to keep them warm. 6 months later, I stood on the wooden deck of a small cabin. It was my cabin. I bought it with my own money. The air smelled like pine needles and burning charcoal. I was hosting a barbecue. The deck was packed. Staff Sergeant Miller was laughing by the grill. Private Davis was handing out cold drinks. General Harrison had even stopped by for a beer. I leaned against the wooden railing. I looked at the people surrounding me. They respected my boundaries. They honored my scars. True family is not defined by blood. True family is defined by the way they protect your dignity. I had fought a brutal war in the desert, and an even uglier war in my own home. But standing there, listening to the laughter of my chosen family, I knew the truth. I had won. I was finally, completely at peace. The silence that followed the parking lot confrontation was not empty. It was a loaded, vibrating silence. It was the calm before the final, desperate strike. When you cut off a parasite, it does not just accept starvation. It searches for a new vein, or it tries to violently reopen the old one. For 2 weeks, my phone was completely quiet. The bank accounts remained frozen. The cease and desist order held its ground. I went to work. I led my intelligence briefings. I ate my meals in peace. But I knew the psychology of the people I was dealing with. Richard was neutralized by his own pride and the fear of federal fraud charges. Evelyn was drowning in bankruptcy paperwork. That left one remaining threat. The architect of the entire illusion. My mother, Margaret. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my living room, reading a physical book. The burner phone I kept for classified command alerts buzzed. Only 3 people in the world had that number. None of them were related to me. I answered it. The sound of ragged, wet sobbing poured through the speaker. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "Claire, please do not hang up." Margaret wept. Her voice was frail, trembling with manufactured terror. "I am at the county hospital. My heart, the doctor says it is failing. I need a bypass." Richard left me. He is so angry about the money. Evelyn will not answer my calls. "You are the only one I have left. Please, I need you to sign the financial guarantor forms. They will not operate without a deposit." 10 years ago, my chest would have seized. I would have dropped the book. I would have run to my car. I would have drained my savings account before even asking for the doctor's name. That was the old Claire. That was the traumatized daughter who believed her only value was being the family savior. I did not drop the book. I kept my breathing perfectly level. I listened to her cry. "Which county hospital?" "Margaret," I asked. My voice was sterile. It held zero emotional weight. She choked on a sob, playing the fragile victim perfectly. "Mercy General. Room 402. Please hurry, Claire. I am so scared. I know we made mistakes, but I am your mother." I disconnected the call. I did not rush to the door. I walked over to my laptop. I was a military intelligence officer. I did not operate on blind panic. I operated on verified data. I pulled up the directory for Centurne General Hospital. I routed a call directly to the cardiology ward nursing station. I gave them my credentials. I asked for the status of Margaret Olson in room 402. The nurse on the other end was confused. She checked the registry. Room 402 was a pediatric overflow room. It was currently empty. There was no Margaret Olson admitted to the hospital. There was no failing heart. There was no emergency surgery. It was a calculated, vicious lie. It was a trap designed to bypass the legal cease and desist order. She was trying to weaponize my fundamental human decency. She wanted me to rush to a hospital that did not have her. Panicked and desperate, so she could corner me and manipulate me into unfreezing the stolen money. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. It was not sorrow. It was the final, undeniable confirmation that the woman who gave birth to me possessed no maternal instincts. She viewed me purely as a utility. I picked up my phone. I did not call her back. I called Major Hayes. I explained the situation. I gave her the recording of the phone call from my secure line. Execute the contingency plan, I instructed. The next morning, 2 uniformed police officers accompanied a process server to my parents' house. They knocked on the front door. Margaret answered. She was not in a hospital gown. She was wearing a silk robe, holding a cup of artisan coffee. She looked perfectly healthy. The officers informed her that faking a medical emergency to bypass a federal cease and desist order constituted criminal harassment. They handed her a final legal notice. Explicitly stated that the next point of contact would result in her immediate arrest for both the harassment and the forged $32,000 disability check. The officers watched the color completely drain from her face. She tried to cry. She tried to play the victim for the badges. The officers did not flinch. They tipped their hats, turned around, and walked away. That was the exact moment the war ended. The final boundary was drawn in concrete and reinforced with steel. True human rights mean you have the absolute right to protect yourself from emotional terrorism, even if the terrorist is your own mother. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm. You are not required to offer your neck to the blade just because the person holding it shares your last name. I closed the file on my family. The audit was over. The accounts were closed. I was finally, truly free to begin building a life entirely of my own. The destruction of a toxic ecosystem is only the beginning. The real work is what you build in the empty space left behind. With the financial hemorrhage permanently cauterized, my life began to change with incredible speed. I had spent a decade shoveling my hard-earned capital into a bottomless pit of ingratitude. Now, every dollar I earned stayed in my own hands. Every ounce of energy I possessed was directed toward my own healing and my own future. The fallout in my hometown was absolute, without my hazard pay padding their accounts. The facade of my family's wealth shattered. Evelyn's luxury boutique lasted exactly 4 weeks before the creditors locked the doors. The imported silk curtains were repossessed. The expensive Italian tile was auctioned off. Evelyn was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. She could no longer afford the country club dues, the social circle she had cultivated. The same women who had listened to Staff Sergeant Miller dismantle her lies completely abandoned her. Evelyn was exposed as a fraud, and the community treated her exactly like one. Richard fared no better. His pride was tied entirely to his financial dominance. Without the secret slush fund to cover his bad investments, he was forced to sell his heavy pickup truck. He had to take a demotion at the logging mill just to cover his basic mortgage. He walked through town with his head down. The men he used to brag to now knew the truth. They knew he was a man who allowed his wife to steal a wounded soldier's disability check. He became a ghost in his own life, trapped in a prison constructed entirely of his own arrogance. I did not revel in their downfall. I simply observed it from a great distance. It was the natural, mathematical result of their own actions. I focused on my own mind. I started attending specialized therapy for combat veterans. For years, I thought my trauma was isolated to the burning vehicle in the desert. I learned that my deepest wounds were actually inflicted in my childhood living room. My therapist helped me unpack the complex grief of being the unloved child. I learned that healing is not a linear process. It is a daily commitment to choosing your own peace over the comfort of your abusers. I learned to articulate my own value. Human dignity is not a negotiable asset. Equality is not something you beg for. Every single human being has a fundamental right to respect, autonomy, and financial security. When a family violates those rights, they forfeit the privilege of your presence. We are culturally conditioned to forgive everything in the name of blood. But true love, healthy love, does not demand your destruction as the price of admission. 8 months after the ceremony in the auditorium, I signed the closing papers on my own property. It was a beautiful, secluded cabin nestled deep in the coastal pine forests. It had a wraparound wooden deck and a massive stone fireplace. I bought it with the money that was rightfully mine. I furnished it with things I loved. There were no plastic beauty pageant trophies. There was no fake luxury. Everything in the cabin was solid, authentic, and real. I stood on the deck one late summer evening. The air was cool, and cedar and the distant ocean. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light through the trees. I was hosting a dinner for my real family. Staff Sergeant Miller was sitting in a wooden rocking chair, holding a glass of iced tea, laughing loudly at a joke. Private Davis was expertly flipping steaks on a large charcoal grill. General Harrison sat on the steps, petting a stray dog I had adopted the month before. There was no tension. There were no hidden agendas. There was only pure, unadulterated mutual respect. These were the people who knew the darkest, ugliest parts of war, and they still chose honor. They saw my scars, both the physical ones on my arm and the invisible ones in my mind, and they treated me with absolute dignity. I leaned against the wooden railing and took a deep breath. My chest, which had felt tight and heavy for 35 years, was completely open. The phantom weight of my family expectations was gone. I looked at the people on my deck. I looked at the trees. I looked at the life I had built with my own 2 hands. You cannot control the family you are born into. You cannot force them to love you. And you cannot cure their toxicity with your own suffering. But you hold the ultimate power. You have the power to walk away. You have the power to draw a line in the sand. You have the power to declare that your life, your body, and your resources belong entirely to you. I had walked through the fire, and I had emerged unbroken. The autumn wind stripped the leaves from the coastal oaks. It was a season of shedding dead weight. I felt lighter than I had in 3 decades. My cabin was a fortress of peace. But healing is not a solitary confinement. True healing requires you to take the light you found in the dark and share it with others. I drove into town every Tuesday morning. I parked outside the local Veterans Transition Center. It was a modest brick building. It smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. But to the men and women inside, it was a lifeline. I walked into the main hall. I was not there to swap war stories. I was there to teach survival. Not the kind of survival that requires a rifle, the kind that requires a spine. I stood at the front of a small classroom. 12 young female veterans sat at the folding tables. They were transitioning back to civilian life. They looked exhausted. They looked lost. I knew that exact look. It was the look of someone who had given everything to their country, only to return home to families who only wanted to take. I handed out thick manila folders. They contained financial literacy worksheets. They contained legal resources for setting up independent bank accounts. But mostly, they contained the blueprint for establishing absolute personal boundaries. A young corporal named Jessica raised her hand. Her voice was quiet. She stared at the wood grain of the folding table. She confessed that her parents were demanding her entire deployment savings. They told her it was her duty as a daughter to pay off their massive credit card debt. They called her selfish for wanting to buy her own car. She looked up at me. Her eyes were full of guilt. The psychological trap had already been set in her mind. I walked over to her table. I did not offer a soft, meaningless platitude. I offered her the absolute truth. I looked at the entire room. I spoke loudly and clearly. Respect is not a privilege, I stated. My voice was firm. It is a fundamental human right. You do not owe anyone your future just because they gave you your past. Financial abuse wrapped in familial love is still abuse. A parent who demands you empty your bank account to fund their mistakes does not love you. They are using you. True compassion begins with yourself. You cannot protect anyone else if you allow yourself to be destroyed in the process. The room was dead silent. The young women stared at me. I could see the heavy chains of guilt physically lifting off their shoulders. I taught them how to freeze their credit. I taught them how to legally sever joint accounts. I taught them the exact same tactical financial maneuvers I had used to dismantle my own toxic bloodline. I made sure the educational value of the lesson was completely unavoidable. Equality is not just a political concept, I explained, pacing the front of the room. Equality is how you are treated at your own kitchen table. It means your labor has value. It means your pain has value. If your family treats you like a servant or an ATM machine, they are violating your basic human dignity. You have the absolute right to walk away. You have the right to protect your peace. Jessica wiped a tear from her cheek. She sat up straighter. She picked up her pen and began filling out the independent banking forms. She was taking her life back. I watched her, and I felt a profound sense of purpose. The trauma I had endured in my parents' house was no longer a heavy burden. It had become a masterclass. I had survived the fire, so I could hand these women the map out of the flames. My life was no longer defined by what I had lost. It was defined by what I was actively building. I spent my weekends hiking the rugged coastal trails with my dog. I spent my evenings reading in front of my stone fireplace. I did not miss the chaotic, suffocating drama of my former family. The silence in my cabin was not lonely. It was a canvas. I was finally painting my own life, using my own colors, on my own terms. The first snow of the year fell in late November. It covered the pine trees around my cabin in a thick blanket of white. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that sinks deep into your bones and stays there. I built a massive fire in the stone hearth. The orange flames cracked and popped. I sat in my leather armchair. I held a mug of hot black tea. The local postman had braved the icy roads earlier that afternoon. He left a small stack of mail in the metal box at the end of my driveway. I sorted through the envelopes. There was an electric bill. There was a catalog for winter hiking gear. And then I saw it. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was erratic. It was rushed. It was Evelyn. The return address was a cheap apartment complex 2 towns over. There was no luxury boutique anymore. There was no expensive country club stationery. There was only the desperate scrawl of a woman who had run out of victims. The legal cease and desist order was still in full effect. By sending this letter, she was risking federal harassment charges. She was that desperate. She was that broke. 10 years ago, my heart would have hammered in my chest. I would have felt a suffocating wave of anxiety. I would have opened the letter immediately, terrified of what crisis I was being ordered to solve. Now I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate did not spike. My breathing remained perfectly level. I looked at the envelope. I did not feel anger. I did not feel pity. I felt the profound, unshakable peace of total indifference. I did not open the letter. I did not care what lies she had spun on the pages inside. I did not care what fake emergency she had concocted to manipulate my bank account. Her words held no power over my reality. I stood up from my leather chair. I walked over to the stone fireplace. The fire was roaring. The heat washed over my face. I held the sealed envelope out over the open flames. I opened my fingers. The paper dropped into the fire. The edges curled and blackened instantly. The cheap paper ignited in a flash of bright yellow light. I watched it turn entirely to ash in less than 10 seconds. The smoke drifted up the chimney, vanishing into the cold winter sky. The umbilical cord of guilt was permanently incinerated. I turned my back to the fire. I looked out the large glass window at the snow falling through the trees. I wanted every woman who had ever been made to feel small in her own home to know this exact feeling. I wanted them to know that the guilt is a lie. We are socially conditioned to believe that walking away from family is the ultimate sin. We are told to endure the unendurable. But sacrificing your human dignity for the sake of an abusive family is a tragedy, not a virtue. You are allowed to be the villain in their story, so you can be the hero in your own. You are allowed to protect your financial security. You are allowed to demand absolute, unwavering respect. True healing is not about proving your abusers wrong. True healing is reaching a point where their opinion of you simply ceases to exist. It is waking up in a house that you paid for, surrounded by peace that you fought for, and realizing you are entirely complete. The winter night closed in around the cabin. The fire kept the room warm and bright. I walked into my kitchen to prepare dinner for myself and my dog. I was Captain Claire Olson. I was a combat veteran. I was an intelligence officer. But most importantly, I was a woman who had finally learned how to fiercely, unapologetically, love herself. The war was over. And the rest of my life was beautifully, perfectly mine. Spring arrived on the Oregon coast. It did not come quietly. It broke through the winter ice with heavy rains and roaring winds. The world was washing itself clean. I stood on the porch of my cabin. I watched the water rush through the deep forest ravines. I felt exactly like the landscape, washed clean, stripped of the dead weight, ready for new growth. The workshops I started at the Veterans Transition Center had grown. They were no longer just a dozen women in a folding chair classroom. Word had spread fast. The local community center offered us their main auditorium. We had 50 women showing up every Tuesday morning. Some were military veterans. Some were civilian women fighting their own silent wars at home. The uniform did not matter. The trauma was identical. The financial abuse was identical. I stood at the podium that morning. The room was packed tight. I looked at the sea of faces. I saw mothers, grandmothers, and young wives. I saw women who had been told their entire lives that their only value was in serving others. I was not just a teacher anymore. I was a commander leading a new kind of battalion. We were fighting for personal sovereignty. There is a myth in our society, I said into the microphone. My voice was steady. It carried to the back row. It is a dangerous, toxic myth. It tells us that true strength is infinite endurance. It tells us that a good woman absorbs abuse, smiles, and keeps the family together at all costs. That is not strength. That is slow suicide. A woman in the third row nodded. Her eyes were red. She was writing furiously in a small notebook. True strength, I continued, pacing across the wooden stage, is recognizing your own inherent value. True strength is looking at a person who shares your blood, a person who is manipulating your bank account, and telling them no. Equality does not exist if you are the only one paying the toll. Human dignity is not a reward for good behavior. It is your absolute right from the second you take your first breath. After the session, a woman named Sarah approached me. She was in her late 50s. She wore a worn, faded cardigan. She held her purse tight against her chest. She looked absolutely terrified. She told me her husband and her adult son had completely drained her retirement account. They convinced her it was a temporary loan for a new business venture. The venture did not exist. They used the money to fund a lavish lifestyle while she ate canned soup in the dark. She looked at me with desperate, hollow eyes. They are my family, she whispered, her voice breaking. How can I call the police on my own son? What will the neighbors say? I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. I looked directly into her eyes. I did not let her look away. The neighbors are not paying for your groceries, I said softly, but firmly. The neighbors are not going to hold your hand when you are bankrupt and homeless. Your son made a choice. He chose his luxury over your survival. You are not destroying the family by holding him accountable. He destroyed the family the exact moment he stole your future. You are simply reporting the wreckage. I walked her over to a legal aid volunteer we had stationed in the back of the hall. I watched her sit down. I watched her take the first terrifying step toward freedom. This was my new mission. I was taking the tactical intelligence I used to dismantle enemy networks overseas, and I was using it to dismantle domestic abusers right here at home. Later that week, I received a secure update from Major Hayes. She called my direct line. She informed me that my father, Richard, had attempted to contact the Military Pension Board. He tried to claim he was my legal dependent. He tried to divert a massive portion of my retirement benefits into a new offshore account. He was still trying to find a back door. He was still trying to feed off the host. Major Hayes stopped the fraudulent request instantly. She flagged his name in the federal system. She asked if I wanted to execute the arrest warrants for the forged disability check right now. The cease and desist order had been technically violated. I sat in my cabin. I looked at the fire burning hot in the stone hearth. I thought about Richard. I thought about the sad, desperate old man trying to steal from his own daughter because he had completely destroyed his own life. No, I told Major Hayes. Do not arrest him. I did not spare him out of mercy. I spared him because sending him to federal prison would give him a dramatic story. It would give him a public stage to play the victim. It would give my mother a brand new reason to cry to the community. I refused to give them any more of my energy. I refused to hand them a script. Just block the request, I ordered. Let him sit in his empty house and realize he is completely, permanently locked out. Absolute indifference is a much heavier punishment than a jail cell. I hung up the phone. I did not give Richard another thought. He was a ghost, and I was permanently done being haunted. Summer arrived with a blinding, brilliant heat. The coastal pines smelled of warm resin and salt air. It had been exactly 1 year since the ceremony in the auditorium. 1 year since Evelyn tried to humiliate me in front of 300 Marines. 1 year since General Harrison silenced the crowd. 1 year since I finally opened my eyes and burned the entire illusion of my family to the ground. I opened a heavy wooden trunk at the foot of my bed. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was the purple heart. I picked it up. The gold was cool against my skin. The purple ribbon was perfectly preserved. For a long time, I hated this piece of metal. I hated it because it represented the agonizing gap between my violent reality and my family's comfortable delusion. It was the physical proof of my bleeding, and they had called it a fake prop. But holding it now, in the quiet sanctuary of my own home, the meaning had entirely shifted. It was no longer a symbol of their rejection. It was a symbol of my absolute, undeniable endurance. I had survived the blinding dust storm in the desert. I had saved my team from a burning chassis. I had survived the psychological warfare of my own mother and father. I had saved myself. I was the architect of my own rescue. I placed the metal gently back into the trunk. I closed the heavy wooden lid. I did not need to display it on a wall to know my own worth. I carried my worth directly in my spine. I walked out onto my deck. The sun was setting over the jagged tree line. The sky was painted in violent, beautiful streaks of orange and violet. I poured a glass of cold water. I leaned against the heavy wooden railing. The story of my family is not a rare anomaly. It is a silent, creeping epidemic. It happens behind closed doors in manicured suburbs and quiet country towns every single day. We are often taught that family is an unbreakable bond. We are told from the time we are children to forgive absolutely everything. We are conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water, and therefore, blood demands infinite sacrifice. We are told to keep the peace. We are told not to make a scene. But true human rights begin at home. They begin at the kitchen table. They begin with the fundamental right to be respected. They begin with the right to your own resources, your own labor, and your own peace of mind. Financial abuse wrapped in familial love is still abuse. Emotional manipulation disguised as parental concern is still manipulation. If someone requires you to shrink yourself so they can feel big, they do not love you. If someone demands you empty your pockets so they can fill theirs, they are not family. They are a parasite. Healing does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes, the most profound act of self-love is walking away from the people who demand you set yourself on fire to keep them warm. You do not owe your abusers a seat at your table just because they share your DNA. You deserve spaces where your light is celebrated, not extinguished. You deserve a life where your sacrifices are honored, not mocked. You have the power to audit your own life. You have the power to look at the heavy ledgers of your relationships and calculate the true cost. And if the cost is your dignity, you have the absolute right to close the account permanently. You can build a new family. You can build a new life. You can be the hero of your own story. But first, you must be willing to become the villain in theirs. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power and defining your own worth. Share this video with someone who might be fighting a silent battle behind closed doors. They need to know they are not crazy. They need to know they are not alone. And a final warning: if you suspect someone is manipulating your finances under the guise of family duty, pull your records today. Look at the bank statements. Look at the routing numbers. Do not trust the tears. Trust the math. Protect your peace. Protect your future. You are worth defending. We are conditioned from birth to believe that family is an unbreakable contract. We are told to forgive the unforgivable. We are expected to pour our resources, our energy, and our sanity into a bottomless pit of demands. We do this simply because we share DNA. But financial abuse disguised as a family duty is still abuse. Emotional extortion wrapped in the word loyalty is still extortion. The hardest battle you will ever fight is not on a foreign battlefield. It is at your own kitchen table. When you realize that your empathy is being weaponized against you, it shatters your worldview. But that shattering is exactly where your freedom begins. You have a fundamental human right to protect your peace. You have the absolute right to secure your financial future. You do not owe your abusers a seat at your table. Healing begins the exact second you stop negotiating with people who only want to take. It begins when you look at the heavy ledger of your relationships and refuse to pay another cent of your dignity. Equality means everyone is held to the exact same standard of respect. If a family member refuses to meet that standard, they forfeit their place in your life. It takes immense courage to become the villain in their story. But you must do it so you can finally be the hero in your own. When you walk away from their noise, you will find a new kind of silence. It is not lonely. It is peaceful. It is powerful. And it is entirely yours. You are allowed to choose yourself. This content has been manually researched, constructed, and edited by us to provide meaning and valuable lessons.